Thank you very much for your very warm welcome. I could have talked a lot about Iraq, of course, tonight, but I thought I would talk about the subject of the school, namely international public service. And maybe you'll ask me some questions about Iraq. I was grateful to Patrick for advertising the DVD that we have made of the report on weapons of mass destruction, but I would like myself to make a little advertising for the actual report. When I came back to Sweden in 2003, the Swedish foreign minister asked me if I would set up an international commission to look into how can the world tackle the question of weapons of mass destruction. And I did, with pleasure. And we spent over 2 years, 14 experts, including Bill Perry, your former Secretary of Defense, to write this report, which we adopted unanimously in the year 2006, at the time when the darkest possible period for disarmament in the world. And I wrote in the preface that one day, if things ease up, maybe this report will be of use, and I think that is now. It contains, in a very simple language, an analysis of the problems of nuclear weapons and mass destruction, in particular the nuclear weapons, and also suggestions what one should do, about 60 suggestions all in all. And since we are not convinced that everybody wants to read, we now made a DVD. And I have confessed to you, I've never worked so hard on a manuscript, because I'm used to writing memoranda, speeches of about 12 pages. But here I had to write a script for DVD, and it took me 13 drafts before we settled on. Well, I'm not going to talk about these subjects, but I thought I would speak about public service, because that's also what I've devoted my life to. And I'm very happy to be invited to address the Clinton School of Public Service. I've had the honor on several occasions to be on the speaker's platform with Mr. Clinton and also with Al Gore, and I've listened to Mr. Clinton's broad and deep insights into the need for both public service and private initiative to improve our societies. Now, he was the guest, of course, main principal speaker of these occasions. I was a sort of warmed up his audience with weapons of mass destruction. And then he came with the principal message, how to save the world. Now, I'm glad to be here to share with you some thoughts from my own more modest level experience of professional life. I studied law, as David said, for 5 years at the University of Uppsala in Sweden. It was immediately after the end of the Second World War, and Sweden had been lucky not to be occupied by Germany. We had been isolated, and I longed to see the world and experience the outside world. And I thought I might try to join the Swedish Foreign Service, become a diplomat. However, a friend of mine warned me and said, "Do you want to be someone who spends your life at cocktail parties and lunches?" And he said, "Diplomats are people who think twice before saying nothing." Well, I was much too serious and idealistic a young man to spend my life at cocktail parties and not saying anything. I wanted to do something serious, so I ruled out diplomacy and decided to specialize in public international law. The states of the world needed to apply less armed force and more law, I thought. I still think so. Only much later have I realized that the diplomatic cocktail parties can be excellent workplaces, where in limited time you can get a grab of sandwich, and you can pick up much information. You can also pass out that information to others. A very practical working place. And I've also learned that it is mostly better to think twice and offer no comment than to come out quickly with an unwise remark that you regret later. Someone once asked me what was the difference between the blunt-speaking U Thant, Secretary General of the UN, and the sometimes very oracle-like Dag Hammarskjöld, my compatriot. And the answer was that Hammarskjöld, of course, was an inscrutable Oriental. Well, in my anti-diplomatic bias, I went to Cambridge University in England and to Columbia University in New York, and I studied under two of the most remarkable, greatest professors of international law of that time, Hersch Lauterpacht in Cambridge and Philip Jessup in New York. It was a joy and a privilege. I learned about the structure and law of a community rather different from our modern and national states, where laws are adopted by majority votes in popular elected legislatures, where you can go to court that can decide on disputes, and where the police enforces the law, that's to say in the national communities. Some scholars in the field of international relations will simply deny the existence of international law and an international community. Of course you can, if you so choose. You can define them out of existence. However, you do that at your peril. A centrally placed US ambassador, my discretion forbids me to mention his name, said a few years ago that international agreements were not binding on the United States. Congress can pass legislation ignoring international agreement. It can, but there are likely to be consequences. Not a judgment by the International Court of Justice, whose jurisdiction the US might not accept, but other consequences. Any state, especially the great powers, have a need for credibility. A simple way of losing credibility international is to ignore agreements that they have entered into. In some ways, the international community and laws reminds me of primitive communities, where violence may not have been deterred by fear of punishment through public authorities, but fear of the blood revenge, retaliation, vendettas, old parallels to the mutually assured destruction that we talk about between nuclear weapon states, where they threaten if one strikes, there will be a second strike. That's a vendetta. That's not the rule of law, but that's a rule of the force and of retaliation. Somewhat similar in the primitive communities where you have blood revenge, vendettas. Where courts in the primitive communities were not available to settle disputes, but where arrangements like conciliation or mediation, village councils and like were employed, and where the binding force of agreements between communities like tribes did not flow from written law of contracts, but from oaths and solemn ceremonies that testify to the sincerity and the intention of the parties to abide by the agreement. The academic subject of public international law offered an exciting study of a nascent world community and a nascent world law. This was some 50 years ago. There existed much customary, non-codified international law based on long-standing practices, precedents of courts, judgments of tribunals in areas like the law of the sea, the law of consular and diplomatic relations, and the law of treaties. So there was this customary law in large measure. There were also large bodies of rules laid down in multilateral treaties, conventions with almost universal adherence, like the Geneva Conventions on prisoners of war. There were a number of international organizations like the United Nations and the World Health Organization, whose members agreed to respect certain basic rules and to set up councils in which they could discuss and agree on further rules and common action. They established secretariats to assist them and to carry out some of the decisions of their councils. It was a fascinating new world that I became aware of. And I remember a fellow student at Cambridge walking up to the professor and he said that, you know, Professor, every morning I wake up, I tell myself, how wonderful, another day full of international law. Well, I thought he laid it on a bit thick. But basically, I didn't disagree with him. I've always found the rest of my life that the study of international law is very exciting and also a hope for the future. After my studies, I spent a short time happily teaching international law at the University of Stockholm. And since then, I have spent all my professional life in public service. First, about 20 years in the national public service as a legal advisor to the Swedish Foreign Minister, and then as a state secretary for Swedish foreign aid, and lastly as a foreign minister. And then I spent about 20 years of international public service with the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna and with the UN in New York in charge of the weapons inspections in Iraq. There have been tremendous developments in the international community and expansion of international law since my study days, and I have had the great privilege and luck to participate actively in some of this. Large areas of customary international law have been codified. In the 1960s, I experienced firsthand the conference that codified the law of treaties. No small thing. May sound a little academic, it's no small thing. It gave the world community its law of contract. And law of contract, I think no one of you who deal with law would ignore as a subject. I took part in the so-called Outer Space Committee that agreed to the first rules on activities in space. It also gave me a free trip down to Cape Canaveral to watch one of your launchings. I was very active in the conference in the 1970s, in which, after the Vietnam War, we sought, with some success and much support from the US, to update the additional rules concerning warfare, the first effort to do this since the conferences in 1899 and 1907, a time when air warfare did not even exist. I took part in the first UN conference on the environment in Stockholm in 1972, and I helped to draft major parts of the policy declaration that was adopted at that time, and later has been quite useful as a guiding policy instrument in the field of environment. In those days, we were not worried about global warming. We had heard of CO2, but it wasn't a major concern. It was rather the acid rains that made the forest and lakes acid that we were worried about. We were worried about cross-frontier pollution, about sulfur dioxide, and about nitrogen oxide. From 1961 to 1981, I was a delegate to the General Assembly of the UN, and I experienced the UN becoming an organization for all the states in the world, but also becoming more cumbersome. And during the same period, I advised my country, the disarmament delegation in Geneva, and saw a number of arms control instruments come into being, like the Partial Test Ban Treaty in 1963, that still needs to be supplemented by a comprehensive test ban treaty under which states will agree to test no more nuclear weapons. From 1981 to 1997, I was then Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, about which you read quite a lot these days, not least about the debates and discussions with Iran. And that period involved me in the creation of major international instruments that regulate the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Conventions about minimum standards of safety in nuclear reactors, about the minimum standards of disposal of radioactive waste, about responsibility for any damages flowing from accidents, and the safeguard system, the verification system under which we go to peaceful nuclear sectors and examine and verify there is no diversion of fissile material for weapons purposes. It was contributing to the building up of a legal infrastructure for an important new activity, namely the use of nuclear energy. Some of you may not like it, but I will tell you that I have a simple political compass. I'm in favor of nuclear power and I'm against nuclear weapons. And I realize that no energy source is without dangers, and therefore we have to build up a good international legal infrastructure around it, and that's what I've spent many years of my life to help to do. In many other areas, I've only been an interested bystander. You can't be at everything. I have not dealt with the law of the sea very much, nor have I helped very much in the fundamentally important work of building up the European Union. It's a big, an enormous enterprise. I have no merit or no credit in being in that. I've been in other pots. Now let me make some comments first on the rationale for public service, and then zero in on the rules and roles of public service linked to the international community. Public service, whether in the area of fire protection, or defense, or justice, health, or education, is always meant to satisfy some interest identified as common in a community. The members of a national or a city community may define, mostly by majority vote, such common interest and decide to set up services and pay for them, including the hiring of public servants. The interest identified as common may vary over time and from country to country. When people lived in rather isolated small farms, they did not have so many common interests and needs. In very early societies, even upholding customary norms relied, as I mentioned, on the private individuals, on blood revenge for acts that were deemed unlawful. Urbanization in the world, and now today I think more people live in cities than outside cities, but urbanization meant greater proximity, and it generated more common interest and common institutions and services. Some of you may have seen Rembrandt's famous painting, The Night Watch, that hangs in Amsterdam. Well, that was an early public service, the night watch. One of the most fundamental needs of society and communities to watch against fire coming loose. Firefighting and military defense public order and justice were classical, rudimentary public services, activities cared for by the whole society and often paid out of a common kitty. In our time, we can see a mixture of public and private activities performing services needed by our communities. Defense is mainly a public service, but also private organizations, you see, not least in this country, are hired to perform roles in the military field. Public order may be maintained mainly by community police, but protection through private individuals is also provided, given commercially or often on voluntary services. In Stockholm, you have areas where parents are patrolling squares or streets in order to make sure that the youth will be not too unruly. Justice is never privatized, but private mediation or arbitration may sometimes replace the public institution, public service based on agreement between the parties. For one thing, it's often cheaper than go through the public services. Basic education available to all is commonly provided through public institutions, but there are also privately financed institutions as well, as we know. And similarly, healthcare, as we know in this country right now in the debate, is often publicly provided and financed, but private institutions, whether commercial or charitable, may be a big part. Licensing of hazardous activities and products is normally a public service, air traffic, trains, nuclear, drugs, etc. But internet is not regulated by the public side. It's a privately regulated activity. Where the border is to go between the public and the private here, well, this we can discuss, and different views on, depending upon what values you have. And I tore out this morning from Forbes magazine an advertisement that amused me. It said, "We are the private sector and we have had enough." And it says that government was created to serve the people, not the other way around, but over the last few decades, the situation has become imbalanced. Public sector workers enjoy higher pay, better benefits, early retirements, and subsidized health insurance. I don't read the whole thing to you. But coming from a country where probably more than 50% of the GDP goes through the public service and still surviving as a liberal and not as a socialist, I think that the spectrum and the divide goes in a different place here. And that's for you to decide on, not for me. Now I turn to the international public service, which is much less developed than the national one. The earliest international public service institutions were set up by states in the area of communications, understandably. The World Postal Union was one of the very first, and the International Telecommunications Union, another one. And in the treaties that formed the basis for these organizations, in the statutes, member states agreed to follow certain rules on how they should cooperate practically, but they also needed secretariats and to serve them in running and meetings and implement some of the measures that they decided upon. The League of Nations that was created after the First World War was also legally a treaty between governments that was termed the Covenant. President Wilson took the initiative to this world organization, but as you remember, the Senate did not ratify it, and sadly, therefore, the United States did not join it. Members did commit themselves to important rules and procedures, but the organization never became universal. Large parts of the world were still under colonial rule, and with the Second World War, the League of Nations collapsed. It is nevertheless of interest to study the Secretariat of the League of Nations. It was intended to have a very modest role, assisting member states in organizing meetings, preparing dossiers, and providing minutes of discussions and conclusions. And the first Secretary General of the League, Sir Eric Drummond, a Britisher, he saw the British civil service as the model. To have confidence of all members, the Secretariat should be neutral and not enter into matters of substance. It was for the political organs of the League, consisting of the representatives of states, of governments, to decide. The Secretariat should compile relevant material in a balanced manner and submit it to the representative government. The Charter of the United Nations follows the line of the Covenant, but there are important differences. The need remains for a Secretariat that has the confidence of all members. The Secretariat may be asked to compile dossiers of data, do the reports, descriptions of events, similar to what they did at the League, but they must always do this in manners that are as objective as possible. And that's not always an easy task. During the Congo crisis, Dag Hammarskjöld, who had given much thought to the role of a civil service, experienced the wrath of the Soviet government at the time. In an interview with Walter Lippmann, the Soviet leader, Khrushchev said that while there are neutral countries, there are no neutral men. He didn't speak about women. Lippmann drew the conclusion that in the Soviet view, there can be no such thing as an impartial civil servant in this deeply divided world, and that the kind of political celibacy which the British theory of civil servant calls for in international affairs is a fiction. That, Walter Lippmann concluded, was the Soviet view. Well, quite logically, Khrushchev advocated that the United Nations Secretariat, like the world as he saw it, should become organized as a troika, with 1/3 from the East and 1/3 from the West and 1/3 from the non-aligned bloc. In such a structure in the Secretariat, he no doubt calculated that the East would be able to exercise a veto, similar to the veto that it enjoyed in the Security Council, and he could thereby also paralyze actions handed to the Secretariat by the Security Council. The Soviet Troika never achieved traction, but it happens not often, but occasionally, that reports presented by a Secretariat are criticized by one government or another as biased, unfounded, unfair, or incomplete. And right these days, you have seen there that Richard Goldstone's report about war crimes in connection with the Gaza war, that they existed. This report has been very strongly criticized from one side, but on the whole, I think respected and upheld by the majority. I wouldn't dare to give international secretariats a blanket endorsement for impartiality, but mostly, and I think deservedly, they are giving greater credibility than governments that complain. This credibility is something that all heads of international organizations and members of their secretariat must guard and uphold as their most precious possession. And I would submit that also governments have a tremendous use of international secretariats that are acting and trying to be impartial. Maybe true, as Khrushchev says, that no one man or woman, can be 100% objective, but there is a big difference between those who try to be objective and those who do not try. I remember making that argument to a very famous Soviet ambassador who was a candidate for the International Court of Justice, and he sort of, well, not very voluntarily, but he did not disagree with me. Now, to uphold this impartiality, secretariats do rely on the rules of the Charter and a long and respectable international tradition. Article 100 of the UN Charter, and there are similar provisions in other constitutions of international organizations, that article reads in paragraph 1 that in the performance of their duties, the Secretary General and the staff shall not seek or receive instructions from any government or from any other country external to the organization, authority external to the organization. They shall refrain from any action which might reflect on their position as international officials, responsible only to the organization. So that's the charter basis for the Secretariat. In paragraph 2, it has a mirror obligation for states. Each member of the United Nations undertakes to respect the exclusively international character of the responsibilities of the Secretary General and the staff, and not seek to influence them in the discharge of their responsibilities. Well, these are the square and fairly strong rules of the Charter. And of course, in reality, I think you will ask me, did the Soviet and the communist states always respect the independence of their own citizens who were the secretaries of the UN? And I should say no, they certainly did not in that period. Now, I think yes, but not in the days of the Soviet Union. Or do governments always respect independence, and do they never try to influence the secretariats? Well, of course they do. The word influence can mean many things, and it's legitimate that they try to present their views. It's another matter if they try to exert pressure. I will say that when I was the head of the UNMOVIC, there was a minor occasion at the end when I felt that a representative of the United States went too far in trying to urge me in a particular direction. But for the rest, Patrick mentioned Negroponte a while ago. My relations with the governments were very correct, including the US government. The ways they try to make influence is more through media dropping a hint, why don't you ask Blix about this or that, and thereby to exert pressure. But in direct relations, no. I think the US, in my case, were very correct. I do not give a clean bill of health in other instances, but in my case. There are also some practices that are followed to avoid the risk of a bias from secretariats. For instance, it seems improbable that a national of any one of the P5 states, the big powers, would be chosen as the Secretary General of the United Nations. Maybe if the great powers come very cooperative in the future, conceivable, but we have not seen it so far. We have not had members from any P5 in that position. And in the organization that I served for 16 years, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the first Director General was in fact an American, a congressman, for a rather short time. After him came two Swedes, my predecessor Sigvard Eklund, who served for 20 years as the Director General. And I served there for 16 years. So for 36 years we had a Swedish top of the IAEA. Then came one Egyptian, my successor, Mohammed El-Baradei, who I once recruited to the organization, and he has been there for 16 years and now left, and now a Japanese national has been selected. It's evident that the selection of high-level staff near the heads of organization attract interest, and here there's a different picture. Here you find mostly representatives of the big powers. They want to ensure that their views shall be heard by the heads of the organization. Sometimes one might even get the impression that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council consider it evident that they shall also have permanent seats near the heads of the secretariats. And this is by no means born out of the statutes of the organizations. Article 101 of the UN contains some lines that show that the drafters saw the composition of the Secretariat as having some importance for the impartial functioning of the Secretariats. It reads as follows: the paramount consideration in the employment of the staff shall be the necessity of securing the highest standards of efficiency, competence, and integrity. But then it goes on to say that due regard shall be paid to the importance of recruiting staff on as wide a geographical basis as possible. So there's practically always been a Russian, an American, a Britisher, a French, a Chinese, and Japanese near the heads of the international organizations, and that is true for the UN. And I think they find that almost a natural right, and it may be very difficult to go away from it. And I do not at all deny that these countries are usually able to come forward with candidates who are very high caliber, but not necessarily perhaps the very best in the community. Now, to this regard of broad geographical representation, to ensure that all views are heard and available in the Secretariat, comes now an added pressure for a balanced gender representation. I confess that I've always felt that any deviation from the paramount consideration of professional competence has some cost of good functioning. And I'm happy to say that the number of women in director positions in the IAEA increased very considerably when I was the Director General, and I do not think that the standard at all reduced by that. On the contrary, they were very competent. I think all, including the big powers, are better served by international organizations being staffed by highly competent international executive heads and officials by persons of their own nationality. I remember when I first came to the IAEA in 1981, one of my first appointments had to do with the office in New York, our representative in New York. It had always had a Russian, and it was always told to me that it had always been a KGB man, located with diplomatic immunity, on the chair of the IAEA. And I looked at the candidates, and there was an Egyptian who had written a 3-volume analysis of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Mohammed Ibrahim, well, never mind, I forget which name at the moment, come back in a moment. I appointed him. And that was a tremendous amazement. Mohammed Shaka was his name, an amazement of people. And the Russian ambassador came to me in Vienna and practically said that I had violated the statute of the organization, but there was not much he could do. So Mohammed Shaka was installed in New York and later became ambassador in Washington, a great authority on non-proliferation. So you can, but the pressure of the big powers to have trusted people or people they believe in close to the tops is very strong. And I think they would be better off if they simply looked at the competence of the people. At no time during my international experience was an objective professional management of the organization I headed more important than when I was in charge of UNMOVIC and the Iraq inspections in 2002 and 2003. The Security Council had given us mandate and to examine the existence of and to eradicate any weapons of mass destruction. And I'm proud to say that at no time did any member of the Security Council criticize us as being biased or inefficient or unprofessional. And this is also true of the US government. Some media, above all in the US, were highly critical of us and insinuated that there were political reasons when, despite 700 inspections in some 500 sites, UNMOVIC did not find any weapons of mass destruction. We have been vindicated on this point, and indeed the institution of international inspection, despite its low cost, it cost about $80 million a year, has come out with a good reputation for professionalism and objectivity, while national intelligence came out with a damaged profile in the case of Iraq. And it's important that the UN and states have at its disposal as objective analysis as possible. If you go to a parallel with medicine, if you do not have a correct diagnosis, how can you expect to find a valid therapy? Some of you may have seen me in the thing that really made me famous in the world, namely the Team America DVD. Though there are not so many young here, but I think the young have all seen it. I'm standing in front of the North Korean leader Kim Jong-il, and I'm telling him that unless he complies with our demands, I will report on you. And I look like a good international bureaucrat. And upon which he pronounces a phrase that decorum here forbids me to repeat. And then presses a button, and I tumble down into an aquarium full of sharks. This, of course, is irresistibly funny, especially to the sharks. Now, there's only one minor misunderstanding by the authors of the film, and that is that a report by a UN authority may have very great weight in the decision-making of governments. One reason why the United States did not get an authorization for the Iraq War in 2003 was that the majority of the members had a respect for the reports of the inspectors, and we had not reported any weapons of mass destruction, and the majority of the members wanted more reports from inspectors. So a report can have some significance. The same was true in the Korean War in 1950, where there was an observation mission of the UN. They came out with a very clear report that the attack came from the north, and it had a major impact in the UN. Now, where is the major onslaught on the workings of an international public service? The international organization is somewhat limited in the means of its defense. We are not used to stand up and defend against member governments. We are supposed to work for them all. Now, sometimes there can be justified reasons for justified criticism on wrongdoing, and in such cases, of course, international secretaries will have to acknowledge what has been wrong. But secretaries do not like to get into dogfights with member states, even when they feel unfairly criticized. And I think the intense allegations in the US in particular, large-scale corruption in the context of the UN program Oil for Food in Iraq was such a case. Here the campaign was orchestrated as an onslaught on the whole United Nations to discredit the whole UN. There was not much substance in this onslaught. The program in question might perhaps have been rightly criticized as short on efficiency, but as Mr. Volkers, your former head of the Fed, found in his thorough inquiry, there was very little corruption. A little, but very little. The major reason why Iraq could extract money from exporters and importers was that its business partners in various parts of the world, including the US and including my own country, cooperated with the Iraqi regime in violating the UN rules. And governments were well aware of this practice and did not put down their feet. The food aid was what matters. They wanted to prevent starvation in Iraq, and they knew that arms were not being imported. Let me conclude on another point. While executive heads of international organizations may be even-handed and the Secretariat staff must be unbiased and objective, the organizations can no longer be limited to placing pencils in good order on the tables until the government representatives come, discuss, and decide. The volume and varied scope of the matters that are handed to and handled by the UN and the other international public services are nowadays so great that there is a necessity for member states to leave much of what they have agreed on to be implemented in the field by secretariats acting as their executive organs as public service. For instance, peacekeeping today is a huge activity costing more than $1 billion a year and with over 100,000 UN blue helmets in different parts of the world. This is no small executive activity, no small public service, and it's indispensable. You can have wars authorized, armed action authorized to a country like the US or others in a particular place, but much of it will have to be carried out as a joint operation. In politically difficult environments, it may often be a challenge to decide on action that is even-handed and truly reflects the mandate that may be have been formulated by international councils like the Security Council, and which may have been formulated with some ambivalence and may not have been fully agreed to in the first place. However, I'm convinced that international public services have probably failed more often in efficiency than in impartiality. The Secretary General of the UN is given the political power, both in the Charter, he is given the right to submit items to the Security Council, and frequently governments ask him to take on tasks, hand him tasks which are politically sensitive. He can no longer be a simple civil servant like Sir Eric Drummond in the League of Nations would have liked. There is also the fact that world public opinion and media now want the Secretary General and directors of agencies to express views on a vast number of politically charged issues. If they simply think twice and then consistently say no comment, they will be written off as nobodies, both by the media and by the public. Interestingly, the main reason for demanding the views of Secretary General or executive heads may well be that in a world resonating with strong but contradictory national standpoints, media and the public may look to some persons for views that are not colored by national interest. Executive heads are well advised, however, to respond sparingly to these demands to pronounce themselves as impartial judges in innumerable controversies, or else they risk that in the long run they find that governments all over criticize them rather than respect them. Now let me conclude with an experience I had at the UNMOVIC. Of course, I had never molested or really badly treated anywhere, even by people who were in favor of the Iraq War. But I had mails, emails, and one time in early 2000, February 2002, I had a mail from a fellow who said that if you cannot see the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, I advise you to go and see your optician. So I didn't usually answer, but I answered this fellow. I answered that I thank you very much for your kind recommendations, and I would plan to go to an optician, and I would like to have a pair of glasses with neutral lenses. And then he came back in another email, and he said, that's right, get rid of those rosy-colored lenses that you have. And I was tempted to write another mail to him saying that, yes, I will get the neutral lenses. Do you think I should order a pair for the Pentagon as well? However, I had other things to do, and I didn't want to continue the polemics, so the mail didn't go off. But it was an idea I could have acted upon. Well, I'll stop at that.
We have time for a few questions. We have a couple of mics roaming around. If you'd raise your hand, I will point to you, and if you stand up and wait for the mic, we'll start with you back there, sir.
Dr. Blix, good evening. Earl Burris, PhD learner from North Central University. I have a question regarding your experience in Iraq. In his memoir, a retired Iraqi Air Force Chief of Staff stated that WMD was loaded aboard commercial airliners and flown out of Iraq prior to the invasion. Have you heard, and do you have any comments on the claims made by this Iraqi Air Force General, General Sada?
That there were weapons of mass destruction loaded onto airplanes or what?
No, that they were loaded onto commercial airliner type aircraft in Iraq and flown out. Have you heard those?
No, there were
claims?
rumors in the media that weapons of mass destruction had been taken out of Iraq to Syria. But I saw even U.S. military expressing very serious doubts about that. And I find it very unlikely that the Syrians would have wanted to receive such weapons. So I do not see corroboration of that anywhere. We had, in the IEA, we had been on the nuclear sector since 1991. And the nuclear field is less difficult to inspect and verify than chemical and biological, because there is a logic in what you do with nuclear. You go from uranium mining, yellow cake, and then to hexafluoride, from hexafluoride to enrichment. And so you know if you have A, then you can look for B, and you can look for C. It's a little easier than the chemical ones. And we had very skillful people who traced it all and who understood exactly the program and could also supervise the destruction of that sector. Now, when the US was preparing for the war, I think they found the possible nuclear threat the most persuasive. That was the argument that could be solved most easily, or least difficulty. But they came out, as you remember, with statements that Iraq had made an agreement with the state of Niger for the import of yellow cake, uranium oxide. That was in the autumn of 2002. It was not my desk then, it was Mohammed al-Bardei's task to look at it. I thought it rather unlikely. Why should they import yellow cake that is such a long way from a nuclear weapon? So I doubted it a bit. And I know that the IAEA tried to get a copy of this alleged agreement. They didn't get it until in February 2002. It took them less than 1 day to establish that this was a forgery. Less than 1 day. The head of the paper that was written, agreement was written upon, but it was not the type that Niger used at the time. The minister had signed it, was not in office at the time of the signature, and so forth. So, and yet, your president was able to go to Congress in a State of Union message and refer to this as an indication that here was a collusion between Iraq and Niger in the nuclear field. Similarly, Mohammed al-Bardei revealed this in February 2002 in the security, before the war started. And he also came out and discredited the allegation that aluminum tubes had been imported for the use in centrifuges. It was much doubted in intelligence in the US and other places, but it was never used as an argument. I think frequently, I'm not engaged in intelligence, and I often say that for verification of nuclear proliferation, you need to have both intelligence and international verification. They use totally different means. The intelligence, there are lots of satellites, they have lots of interception of telephone calls, they have lots of spies, etc., defectors, etc. The international verification uses other means. We are there on the ground. We have agreements that we can see any place, we can talk to any person, we can demand any documents. I mean, we have our specialties, as it were. And I think a government sits in the receiving end of both these, and they should then see if they tally. If they don't tally, well, then they should be suspicious. They should ask themselves, well, is this really right, or are the inspectors wrong? And I think the most telling thing we had that should have warned the US and the other states was that they gave us kindly tips about sites to inspect. We asked them, tell us, you are convinced there are weapons of mass, where do you think they are? And they gave us perhaps 100 sites, and we had time to inspect about 3 dozen of them. And in none of these places did we find any weapons of mass destruction, and we told the intelligence, we told the Security Council about that. Now, I take it that they would have given us the best sites, and I said after the war broke out that if this was the best, what was the rest? But they should also have learned from it. If the best sites they had contained nothing, then they should have become much more skeptical of the defectors' stories which they heard. many of them were. There were many on the US intelligence who were skeptical. But the question marks that existed in the intelligence community were erased and replaced by exclamation marks when it came to the political level. It was a very, very expensive, horrible affair, horrible for the US and horrible for the Iraqis and horrible for the world. And I come back to the point that if you do not have a correct diagnosis, how can you expect to have a valid therapy of it? And that is one of the values of a public international service.
Question. Back there.
Thank you, Dr. Blix. I'm Latif Salim, a student, Clinton School student from Afghanistan. I would like to get your idea about Iran's nuclear ambition. There are some politicians, they believe that an atomic Iran is going to cost for the United States a lot more than military operation. And from your view, is military operation the only choice to disarm Iran, to prevent Iran from becoming a nuclear power? And second, if you are asked to advise President Obama on how to deal with Iran, what would you tell him? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I thoroughly reject the view that military means should be a viable means. And I think diplomacy is by far not exhausted in this case. Now, Mohammed al-Bardei says that he does not think that it's conclusively shown that Iran has been aiming at nuclear weapons. Though a great many people, and I think for very good and understandable reasons, suspect that yes, this was an aim. It could also be that the aim is to place them closer to the option of a nuclear weapon. Even that is something that can have a deterrent effect. I would side with Mohammed that it may not be conclusively shown, but Iran has been set up an enrichment program which costs a lot of money, and they have 2 nuclear power reactors that are soon in operation, and they are planning many more. My own country, Sweden, has 10 nuclear reactors in operation. We find it cheaper, less expensive to import the low-enriched uranium that is needed. South Korea has 20 nuclear reactors in operation. They also find it less expensive to import. So I don't think it can be an economic proposition on the Iranian part. They started this program, moving towards this program in the 1980s. And that was a time when they could certainly have suspected Iraq of moving to nuclear weapons. You remember that Israelis bombed the Iraqi reactor, Iraq, in 1981. And Iraq did not at the time have any enrichment or reprocessing, but they were suspicious. And surely the Iranians who had a horrible war with the Iraq in the 1980s would also have been suspicious. I'm sure they wouldn't have liked to be a neighbor of a nuclear-armed Iraq. So I could see a justification or motivation at any rate for them to move. Since then, however, Iraq has disappeared as a nuclear danger to Iran. And I cannot see that they, like some other states that have gone for nuclear weapons, do it because of fear of a nuclear threat. They're not threatened by Afghanistan or by Pakistan or nowadays by Turkey or by Russia or nowadays by Iraq. They could be fearing the US has kept aircraft carriers, missile-armed aircraft carriers in the Gulf, but not otherwise. And therefore, I'm a little hopeful that in the longer run, with negotiation diplomacy, it might be feasible to persuade them to stay away from enrichment. But the negotiations as they were carried out by the Europeans with the United States for a long time as a backseat driver, in my view, were really rather a great failure. Because they demanded of Iran that they must first suspend all enrichment. Thereafter, they can sit down and talk about what they could be given, one inducement or another, membership in the World Trade Organization, or support for the civilian nuclear power program. There are sensible chips on the table. But only first they must suspend enrichment. And which player in a negotiation throws away your trump card before you get down to negotiation? They did not. And the ones who became impatient were the Western and the US states. I think Barack Obama, whom I admire from much what he does in the field of efforts of disarmament. And I think he has merited the Nobel Prize, although it may not be very helpful to him. But I think that he cut through the ice here. And he said already before elected that his administration would be ready to talk to anybody. It was a bit ridiculed, say, you are not going to talk to Kim Jong-il, are you? Okay, I don't think he was ready to do that. But he meant that his administration could talk. And that's what they've done. He had come out and said that we are ready to send people into direct talk, our representatives. It goes against what the Security Council has said. He's even got the Russians and Chinese to go along with a resolution that says that first Iran must suspend enrichment, thereafter we can discuss. They just ignored it, and they sat down in Geneva to begin talk. Now, I'm not sure that they will succeed. No one can guarantee that, but I can guarantee you that they didn't get anywhere with the old method. They just painted themselves into a corner. Whether it will succeed is, can there be more things, chips on the table? Looking at the negotiation with Korea, there are two chips that are, to my knowledge, they have not used in the case of Iran. North Korea said, you don't need nuclear weapons. We are ready to give you a guarantee against attacks from abroad and against subversion inside North Korea. You don't need them. Well, whether the North Koreans trust their weapons more than such paper promises, I don't know. But that's one thing that they have offered to them and that the North Koreans might influence them. The second is that they tell the North Koreans, look, if we have a deal with you that you stop your nuclear activities, we can also assure you that you will have diplomatic relations with the United States and with Japan. You will be taken out of the refrigerator. You will be again accepted into the international community. We will probably ask you not to smuggle any narcotics in your diplomatic pouches as well. A few other things that decent states should stay away from. But here are two chips that, to my knowledge, have not been used in the case of Iran. And I think they could be on the table. I think there are many other things they could do. They could broaden the agenda. Interestingly enough, Iran said recently that they would be ready to discuss not enrichment, but non-proliferation, and they discussed disarmament. Well, these are interesting openings, I think, for a discussion. I think they will stick to, and they are very proud of the program, and they feel that the NPT allows and permits enrichment, and that is true, and that it does. But I think they will also realize that if they were to pursue to go on with a full-scale, industrial scale enrichment, it might have consequences in the rest of the Middle East. Other countries in the Middle East might do the same thing. There's a broad interest in nuclear power, and there might also be one in the fuel cycle, as say enrichment and reprocessing. And that would not be amusing for Iran as well. There are also possibilities. An old proposal was for a zone free of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. Now, that has been a fairly remote thing, and the Israelis have always felt that their nuclear weapons are sort of life insurance for an existential threat that could occur. And it may well be so, as long as they are alone. But if Israel begins to feel that they might not be alone about this, that Iran and other states might move towards the nuclear weapons or facilities for enrichment, maybe they too might consider that it might be better that no one has it than that several of them have it. So I do not think that the diplomatic means are at all exhausted. The latest things, I think, are played up a little as an optimistic happening. The Iranians are now asked, and they claim that they've agreed that they would take most of what they have enriched to 4%, send it to Russia, or France, or at least to Russia, and have it enriched to 20%, which is needed to make fuel for a research reactor, which sits outside Tehran, American origin, Triga reactor, and by which they make medical isotopes. Well, thereby they would take most of the enriched uranium that they have so far and take it out. But of course, it would not stop them, and they're not going along saying that we will stop enrichment generally. The whole of that negotiation remains. On the other hand, if the West and the Russians were saying, no, we are not going to help you with enrichment for new fuel for your research reactor, then the Iranians can say, well, there you are. We never thought that we would be able to import what we need for medical isotopes, so we have to do it ourselves. So I think they have a strong leverage on the Western world to go along doing something. At the same time, if the Western world didn't go along with this, and if they did the enrichment of 20%, that would exacerbate the situation we are in. If, on the other hand, they get a deal, then it will be seen as an optimistic sign that there can be some progress in this. I don't know which way it goes. It may be decided today, and I'm eager to watch.
Time's running out. I think we have time for two more quick questions. Start with you, sir.
Dr. Blix, what's the difficulties and what do you think are the chances of a WMD being detonated in the U.S. by a terrorist group?
By terrorists? Well, the risks are never zero. I think most of the experts I read think that the least unlikely would be that they would try to put things together in the United States. However, our experience of terrorists using weapons of mass destruction are very limited. The case of a Japanese sect in Tokyo that placed sarin, a chemical weapon, in the Tokyo subway, and a number of people were killed. And I think personally that chemical weapons are the least unlikely for them to use. The biological weapons are difficult to handle. You may perhaps infect yourself. If you go for a dirty bomb, let's say you don't use the fission power, but you use the radiation power of, say, cesium or some other radioactive substance, you might irradiate yourself. So it's not so easy to handle either, although we have seen that polonium was used as a means of killing somebody in London. The risks are never zero. I mean, you be naive, you can never say that. It's just like a nuclear accident. You cannot say that the risk of an accident is zero. But I would say rather small. And I think that we all, maybe we all as human beings have a need of a certain quantity of angst every day. And the media and the politicians supply us a great deal of help in this regard. And one day the angst is this one, or the next day is cholesterol, or the next day it is factor X in some soup, or then the next day is the absence of factor X, etc. So I think we get a lot of this, and I counsel generally prudence, yes. You use our common sense, and I'm not so excited and worried about the terrorists getting it. They have turned to other things like paper cutters, which were simpler to carry than nuclear activities. No, I frankly think that the path that Obama is trying is intelligent. He is saying that for the long run, if we, the P5 and others, are not going for nuclear disarmament, we're saying that we are the ones and we will tell the world who can have these weapons and who cannot, then this double standard, I think, will be understood by others. Say, well, see, they say it is absolutely indispensable for their defense, but it's absolutely horrible if we have it. I think there is a big risk in that. And in a little noticed passage of Obama's speech in Cairo, he said something that was profoundly important. He said that no country has the right to decide who can have nuclear weapons and who cannot have it, being understood that he was in favor of the US and the P5 going away from nuclear weapons. Now with that, he also can say to Iran that, look, we are urging you to go away from this path, and we do so because we think everybody should do so. Whereas until now, we have found that the US and others have said, well, the P5, of course, they must have it, and then India can have it, and Israel can have it, and North Korea absolutely not, and Iran absolutely not. Pakistan, well. So they take it upon themselves to decide for the world who can have it and who cannot have it. And I think Obama's gone away from that. It's a big difference in time perspective, of course, saying Iran should go away from enrichment today, and the US will go away from nuclear weapons, not in my lifetime and probably not in his lifetime. The battle today is not about the ultimate end, doing away, eliminating nuclear weapons. That's a vision, but we don't have illusions, no. Today the battle is about the US ratifying the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty that the Senate rejected in 1999. It would make the US a party, it certainly get Chinese to go there. In fact, I would like the Chinese to ratify it now, and thereby give a push to the US, because the US would be the only country in the world that has not ratified. I fear somewhat a compromise in the US which would consist of ratification of the test ban agreement, at the same time going along with building a new nuclear weapon, which will not be called a nuclear weapon. It will not be needed to test it, etc. But I think that would set a very bad precedent for the rest of the world, that okay, US will stop testing, but it will go on building new types of weapons, taking us up to 2050, 2060. But it seems that we can plan for weapons for 60, 70 years ahead of us, but we cannot plan for disarmament for another few years ahead of us. And when it comes to doing away with most of armaments in the world, I still remain somewhat optimistic. But we do not see the same reasons for wars today as we had in the past, borders or grabbing land, etc. Even ideology is gone as a reason. I feel some hope that this will be possible, and people say that, well, you know, this, you must see, we have always had wars and there will be wars in the future. I say that, look now, over time, things will happen. Between 1910 and 1950, we had 2 world wars, and we had League of Nations set up and collapsing. And aviation, internet, well, internet in 1950, not 1950, but anyway, lots of things between 1910 and 1950. What do you think will happen between 2010 and 2050? A lot of things can happen. Even the United Nations might be revised and reformed in many ways. So I remain at heart an optimist on the future, and I think that the sum the world is now spending, $1,400 billion a year on military expenses, is absurd. 45% is paid by you as taxpayers of the US. Only 3% is paid by Russia. 3%. The UK is spending more on arms than Russians are. And we should remember that. We need to go for détente and drastically reducing the military expenses and put it on defending the climate against global warming. I'm more worried about that than I am about weapons of mass destruction. If we have a dozen of state governments that are acting with some wisdom, I think we can cope with the weapons of mass destruction. The issue of global warming is a business of 6.5 billion people. That's more difficult.